Caleb Mercer rode into Red Hollow for 2 sacks of grain. Before sunset, he was carrying a stranger's trunk to his wagon while half the town watched. The woman sitting outside the train depot had crossed nearly 1,600 miles to marry a man she had never met. Now that man was dead, her money was gone, and the people of Red Hollow were waiting to see how long it took before she broke. Caleb did not yet know her name. He only knew something about her frightened brown eyes made him stop walking. It was August of 1886, and the Wyoming heat pressed down hard enough to bend the grass. Caleb had already loaded the grain when he heard the station master speaking. "Mr. Wilkins died 12 days ago," the man said. "Fever took him. There's nothing anyone here can do for you." The young woman sat straight upon a worn leather trunk. Her dusty green dress was too heavy for the weather, but she did not complain. A faded hat box rested in her lap, and one gloved hand held a bundle of unopened letters. "Is there work in town?" she asked. The station master looked toward the women gathered nearby. "Not the respectable kind." A few people laughed. Caleb stopped beside his wagon. He had spent 6 years teaching himself not to care about other people's trouble. Caring had not saved his wife. It had not saved their newborn son. After burying them beneath the cottonwood behind his cabin, Caleb had learned that silence could not hurt a man unless he fought it. So he stopped fighting. Then someone near the depot whispered, "She came here as a bride. Now she's nothing but unwanted freight." The woman heard it. Her mouth tightened, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She bent to lift her trunk. It barely moved. The station master turned away, and every man on that platform suddenly found something else to look at. Caleb set down the grain sack on his shoulder. His boot struck the wooden boards as he walked toward her. The whispering stopped. "Ma'am." She raised her eyes. Up close, Caleb saw how tired she was. Dust covered the edge of her collar. One glove had been carefully repaired at the thumb. "My name is Caleb Mercer," he said. "I have a ranch 9 miles north of here." Her fingers tightened around the letters. "What does that have to do with me, Mr. Mercer?" Caleb had no good answer. He had not planned any of this. "My cabin has a loft. You could use it. I need someone who can cook and keep the place from falling apart. You'd earn wages and have your own space." The station master stared at him. Caleb Mercer had barely spoken 10 words to anyone in Red Hollow during the past year. Now he was offering his home to a woman whose name he did not know. "What do you expect in return?" she asked. "Work. Nothing more. And if I decide to leave, I'll bring you back to town myself." She studied his scarred hands, his sun-darkened face, and the revolver on his belt. "Why would you help me?" Caleb glanced at the townspeople watching them. "Because nobody else will." Something shifted behind her eyes. "Eliza Bennett," she said. "That is my name." Caleb reached for her trunk. It was heavier than it looked. Something inside struck the wooden wall with a dull thud. Eliza quickly stepped closer. "That trunk stays locked. It belongs to you. You will not ask what is inside? Your secrets are your own." For the first time, her hard expression weakened. Caleb loaded the trunk beside the grain and offered his hand to help her aboard. Eliza ignored it and climbed into the wagon without assistance. As they left Red Hollow, cruel laughter followed them down the street. Caleb kept his eyes forward, but Eliza looked back once. She watched the depot disappear behind a cloud of dust, along with the last promise that had brought her west. Neither spoke for the first 3 miles. When the Mercer cabin finally appeared, Eliza stared at the weathered building, the leaning barn, and the empty garden choked with weeds. "This is your ranch? What remains of it? And you live here alone?" "I did this morning." Caleb carried her trunk into the loft. When he came down, Eliza stood above him beside the ladder. "I will work hard," she said. You will never regret bringing me here." Before he could answer, she closed the loft door. A moment later, Caleb heard the trunk open. Then came the rustle of paper, followed by a small sound that might have been a sob. By morning, Eliza acted as though nothing had happened. Caleb returned from checking fences to find sunlight pouring through a window that had been black with dirt for years. The floor had been scrubbed, a fire burned in the stove, and warm corn cakes waited on the table. Eliza stood near the stove, with loose strands of brown hair against her face. Her hands were red from harsh soap. "You did all this?" It needed doing. Caleb took one bite of the corn cake. It was plain and slightly burned, but it was the first hot meal someone had prepared for him since his wife died. "It's good," he said. Eliza looked away quickly, yet he saw the relief cross her face. Days passed. She repaired his torn shirts, cleared weeds from the old garden, and placed blue wildflowers in a jar at the center of the table. Caleb began leaving fresh eggs beside the stove and pretending he had not collected them for her. They remained strangers, but the cabin no longer felt dead. Then, one cold October afternoon, a terrible scream tore across the prairie. Caleb's mare had stepped into a hidden hole. The horse lay thrashing in the grass, her front leg bent beneath her at a sickening angle. Caleb knelt beside the animal that had carried him through 6 empty years. He knew what had to be done. He pulled his rifle from the saddle. The mare looked at him with wide, terrified eyes as he raised the barrel. His finger touched the trigger. "Don't shoot!" Eliza came running through the tall grass. She dropped beside the injured horse and carefully felt the broken leg. "This bone can be set," she said. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Caleb stared at her. Eliza turned toward the distant cabin, where her locked trunk waited in the loft. "There are things about me I haven't told you," she said. "If you trust me now, I may be able to save her." The mare screamed again. Caleb looked from the rifle in his hands to the woman kneeling in the dirt. Then Eliza gave him an order that made him wonder exactly who he had brought home from that depot. "Bring me the locked trunk," Eliza ordered. "Then find 2 straight branches, clean cloth, and all the rope you can carry." Caleb lowered his rifle. The injured mare lay in the grass, fighting for every breath. Her name was Belle, and she was the last living thing Caleb had allowed himself to love after losing his family. "If she suffers because of this, I will not forgive myself," he said. "She has a chance," Eliza replied, "but you must trust me." Caleb ran for the cabin. When he returned, Eliza unlocked the trunk for the first time. It contained no stolen money or fine jewels. Inside were cloth pouches filled with dried plants, glass bottles wrapped in wool, medical books, seeds, and a small wooden box. "My grandmother treated people who could not afford a doctor," Eliza explained. "The local horse doctor taught her about animals. She taught everything to me." She gave Belle willow bark for the pain. Then she placed her hands above and below the break. "You must hold her still." Caleb lowered himself across Belle's neck. "On 3, Eliza said. 1, 2. She pulled before saying 3. Belle's scream cut through Caleb. The mare kicked and fought while he used his weight to hold her down. Eliza kept pulling until the broken bone moved beneath her hands. A small click followed. Belle fell still, shaking from pain. Eliza bound the leg between 4 smooth branches. Her fingers moved quickly, but Caleb saw them trembling when she finished. "Is it set?" "As straight as I can make it." "Will she live?" Eliza looked at the frightened animal. "We will know by morning." They built a rough sled from fence rails and dragged Belle back to the barn. Every stone beneath the sled made her whimper. By the time they reached the ranch, darkness had covered the prairie. Neither Caleb nor Eliza left the stall that night. Eliza gave Belle water one mouthful at a time. She placed crushed comfrey around the injury and checked the bindings every hour. Caleb sat nearby with his rifle across his knees, knowing he might still have to use it. Near midnight, Belle's breathing became fast and weak. "She is getting worse," Caleb said. Eliza pressed a hand against the mare's chest. "Her heart is racing." She opened the small wooden box and removed the last bottle inside. Only a few drops remained. "What is that?" "Hawthorn medicine. It belonged to my grandmother." "Will it help?" "I don't know." Eliza poured the medicine into Belle's mouth. Hours passed beneath the weak lantern light. Outside, coyotes called from the hills. Caleb heard them moving closer, drawn by the smell of an injured animal. Shortly before sunrise, Belle opened her eyes. She lifted her head from the straw and gave a weak sound. Eliza touched the mare's chest. Then she checked the injured leg. "The swelling is lower," she whispered. "Her heart is steady." Caleb could hardly breathe. "She is going to live." His head dropped into his hands. The tears came before he could stop them. He had held them inside since the day he buried his wife, Ruth, and their baby boy. Now he wept beside a horse that had been spared, and a woman who had refused to let him destroy another piece of his life. Eliza sat beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. Caleb covered it with his own. "You saved her. My grandmother did, through what she taught me. You saved more than Belle." Eliza looked at him, but he could not say the rest. At that moment, hoofbeats approached the barn. A mail rider stopped outside and handed Caleb a thick envelope addressed to Miss Eliza Bennett. It had come from St. Louis. The instant Eliza saw it, all the warmth left her face. She placed the unopened letter on the cabin table, where it remained for 3 weeks. During that time, Belle slowly improved. Eliza slept in the barn and watched over her. Caleb brought food, coffee, and extra blankets. By the 3rd week, the mare could stand. By the 4th, she could take several careful steps. Caleb spent those evenings carving pieces of pine inside the barn. Whenever Eliza asked what he was making, he covered the wood with an old saddlecloth. The letter still waited inside the cabin. One evening, Caleb found Eliza sitting on the porch with the envelope in her hand. "What is in it?" he asked. "My cousin has offered me work as a governess. Good pay, a warm room, and a respectable place in St. Louis." Caleb felt as if the cold had entered his chest. "When will you leave?" Eliza looked at the cabin, the barn, and the garden they had cleared together. "I am not leaving." She walked to the stove, opened its iron door, and dropped the letter into the flames. Caleb watched the paper curl and burn. "Why stay?" he asked. "Because I am no longer waiting for someone else to give me a life. I have one here." Caleb stepped closer. "There is something you must know about me first." He told her how Ruth had suffered for 3 days after childbirth. The doctor could do nothing. Near the end, Ruth had begged Caleb to stop her pain. The doctor left the room. Caleb stayed. "I did what she asked," he whispered. "I have lived with it every day since." Eliza took both his hands. "You did not stop loving her. You loved her enough to carry the pain she could no longer bear." Caleb looked toward the cottonwood where Ruth and the baby rested. Then he went to the barn and returned with a small wooden box. Inside lay a thin gold ring. "This belonged to Ruth," he said. "Last night I stood beside her grave and asked if I was allowed to live again." Tears gathered in Eliza's eyes. "What answer did you get?" "That I have already wasted too many years." Caleb lowered himself onto one knee. "Eliza Bennett, will you stay here as my wife? Not as someone I rescued, not as someone who owes me work. Stay because you choose me." Eliza held out her shaking hand. I chose you the day you lowered that rifle. He placed the ring upon her finger. They waited until Belle was strong enough to make the journey. On the morning they left for Red Hollow, frost covered the grass, and Eliza wore the same green dress she had worn at the depot. As the town appeared ahead, her arms tightened around Caleb. They will laugh at us. Let them! They called me unwanted. Caleb turned in the saddle. You saved my horse, my home, and the man I thought was already dead. There is nothing unwanted about you. They stopped outside Reverend Cole's white church. Caleb helped Eliza down, and together they stepped inside. The Reverend smiled when Caleb asked him to marry them. I will need 2 witnesses, he said. He opened the side door and called in the women waiting next door. The first was the kind postmistress. The second was Mrs. Dawson, the same woman who had called Eliza unwanted freight at the depot. Mrs. Dawson looked at Ruth's ring on Eliza's finger, then turned to the Reverend. Before you marry them, she said, there is something everyone should know about this woman. Mrs. Dawson stepped into the church with her mouth tight and her eyes fixed on Eliza. This woman came west to marry Mr. Wilkins, she said. Less than 4 months later, she is standing here with another man. Does that sound like love to anyone? Eliza's hand became cold inside Caleb's. Mrs. Dawson continued before the Reverend could stop her. Mr. Mercer owns good land. Everyone knows that. Perhaps Miss Bennett learned how much it was worth after he carried her away from the depot. Caleb moved forward, but Eliza held his arm. She had spent years lowering her eyes when others judged her. In St. Louis, silence had kept a roof over her head. At the depot, it had protected the last piece of pride she still possessed, but she was not that frightened woman anymore. You are right about one thing, Eliza said. I came here to marry Mr. Wilkins. Mrs. Dawson gave a pleased smile. I came because I was poor, alone, and afraid. I hoped marriage might give me safety. When I arrived, that hope was dead. The Reverend and postmistress listened quietly. Caleb offered me shelter when no one else would even lift my trunk. He asked for work, not affection. He never entered my room, opened my belongings, or used my fear against me. Eliza raised her left hand, showing Ruth's ring. I am not marrying him for his land. I am marrying him because he saw worth in me before I could see it in myself. Mrs. Dawson's smile disappeared. And if he loses that ranch? She asked. Then I will stand beside him while we build another. The postmistress began clapping. Her hands struck together slowly at first, then louder. Reverend Cole looked at Mrs. Dawson. That answers your concern. Mrs. Dawson turned red. I was only trying to protect Mr. Mercer. Caleb finally spoke. The day Eliza arrived, you called her unwanted freight. Do not pretend cruelty becomes kindness just because you say it inside a church. Mrs. Dawson left without another word. The door slammed behind her. Eliza released a long breath. Her knees felt weak, but she remained standing. Reverend Cole opened his Bible. Caleb barely heard the words. He saw only Eliza beside him, wearing the dress in which she had once been abandoned. Now it was no longer the clothing of a rejected bride. It was the dress she wore while choosing her own future. Do you, Caleb Mercer, take Eliza Bennett as your lawful wife? I do. The Reverend raised one eyebrow. I had several more words to say. I have waited 6 years to answer that question. I do not need any more words. Eliza laughed through her tears. When her turn came, her answer was clear. I do. Reverend Cole closed the Bible. You may kiss your bride. Caleb touched her face with both hands. He kissed her gently, as though she were something precious he had no right to hold too tightly. Eliza placed her arms around him and kissed him again. Outside the church, The postmistress hugged Eliza. "Welcome to Red Hollow, Mrs. Mercer." For the first time, the name did not feel borrowed from someone else's dream. It belonged to her. They rode through town with Eliza seated behind Caleb. People watched from the store windows and wooden walks. Some whispered, but Eliza did not lower her eyes. When they passed the depot, she began to laugh. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "I arrived there believing no one wanted me." He placed one hand over hers, where it rested against his coat. "They were fools." When the ranch came into view, Caleb stopped Belle beside the porch. "I have something for you." He uncovered the object hidden in the wagon behind them. It was a pine rocking chair. The back had been carved with small flowers, and every piece had been polished smooth. Eliza ran her fingers across the wooden petals. "Those are bluebells." "I remembered the flowers you placed on the table." "You made this while I was caring for Belle?" "I thought the porch needed another chair." Eliza sat in it. The rockers moved smoothly across the boards. Caleb lowered himself into the old chair beside her. For years, there had been only one chair on that porch, one cup beside the stove, one plate on the table, one set of footsteps crossing the floor. Now there were two. As the sun fell, Belle walked across the corral. Her healed leg carried her without a limp. "She saved us," Caleb said. Eliza glanced at the mare. "We saved her." "I was talking about you." Eliza reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. When night came, they entered the cabin together. Eliza unlocked her trunk and left it open. She removed the seeds her grandmother had saved, the medical books, and the bottles that remained. At the bottom was an old marriage certificate. "My grandmother gave me this before she died," she said. "She told me to keep it until I found a man with good hands." Caleb looked at his scarred fingers. "These hands have done things I regret. They also carried my trunk when no one else would. They held Belle while I set her leg. They made a chair for a woman who had never owned anything beautiful." Eliza folded the certificate beside their new one. That night, the wind grew stronger. Snow began tapping against the loft window. Caleb woke before sunrise and built a fire. When Eliza came down, the prairie outside had turned white. She stood beside him at the window, her hair loose around her shoulders. "It looks like a different world," she said. "It is." They spent their first winter planning the garden. Eliza marked rows for beans, onions, and tomatoes. Caleb saved a place along the fence for bluebells and roses. When spring arrived, the hard earth opened beneath their tools. They planted vegetables for survival and flowers because survival was no longer enough. Belle grew strong again. The cabin received a new roof, a second chair at the table, and curtains made from the green dress Eliza had worn to the depot. Years later, travelers passing the Mercer ranch often saw two rocking chairs moving together on the porch. Sometimes Caleb and Eliza spoke. Sometimes they simply watched the sunset with their hands joined between them. Caleb never forgot the morning he rode into Red Hollow for grain. He had believed he needed only enough food to survive another winter. Instead, he found a woman stranded beside a locked trunk, carrying the knowledge to heal his horse and the courage to heal the parts of him no doctor could reach. Eliza had crossed the country, hoping a stranger would give her a home. She never expected to discover that home was not a place someone gave her. It was the life she and Caleb chose to build together.